Welcome to the 61st episode of the interview series. The interview series is a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number oneweekcritique.com. And please like and subscribe to help us continue producing valuable content. I'm Matthew Schmidt, joined today by Conor Bracken. Conor Bracken is a poet, translator, and educator. His chapbook, Henry Kissinger, Mon Amour, was selected by Diane Seuss as winner of the 5th annual Frost Place Chapbook Competition. And his debut collection of poems, The Enemy of My Enemy is Me, winner of the 2020 Diode Editions Book Prize, was published in 2021. His translation work focuses on Francophone poetry. Scorpionic Sun, his translation of Mohammed Khaireddin's first full-length collection of poems, was the first English translation of the avant-garde Moroccan writer's work. Another translation of Jean Demeric's No Way in the Skin Without This Bloody Embrace was published by Ugly Duckling Presse in 2022, is Demeric's first appearance in English, and the book was a finalist for the 2023 PEN Award for Poetry and Translation. His work has earned him fellowships from Breadloaf, the Community of Writers, Cornell's Institute for Comparative Modernities, the Frost Place, Imprint, Sewanee Writers Conference, and can be found in places like BOM, New England Review, The New Yorker, Plowshares, and West Branch. He lives in Ohio, teaches classes with Lit Cleveland, and teaches in the liberal arts department at the Cleveland Institute of Art. Welcome, Conor.
Thanks, Matthew. It's great to be here.
Excellent. So today we're going to be looking at some translation drafts of Jean Demeric's No Way in the Skin Without This Bloody Embrace. So I thought we'd start large here, and I'd like to get your entrance into translation. So how did you become interested in the practice of translation and start doing
it? I translate primarily from French, and I translate primarily writers who are not French, but who are often kind of in the post-colonial penumbra of France. And so this is all predicated upon my experience with the French language, which I've been exposed to for almost my entire life, because my father worked for the US government, and a decent amount of my childhood was spent overseas, oftentimes in Francophone speaking countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Morocco, and elsewhere. So when I was younger, I would be in spaces where English was spoken in some places, French, and then other languages as well. So I was aware that, I wasn't living a monoglossic existence necessarily. And, taking language classes from age 5 on up and all that. But the first time that I ever really translated something with any sort of intentionality, I spent a year teaching high school classes in English in France. And at one point I was invited to a poetry reading. And I read some poems in English, and everybody was like, I don't understand what you're saying. So they asked me to translate on the fly in French, which I'd never done before and was very difficult. But I tried, and it was interesting. And fast forward about 5 years later, I was in graduate school. I was about done with my MFA. I took a class in epic poems. And so we were reading Aimé Césaire's Notebook for a Return to the Native Land. And I was giving a presentation on it and wanted to kind of get into some of the intricacies of the language. So I produced a translation of my own of one of the passages from that book. And that's where I really started to understand how literary and how creative of an act it was. Because before that, I'd read work in translation, I'd compared facing translations and said, oh, I might have made choices a little bit differently, but I never really engaged in it. And it bit me at that point. So when I really began to do intentional and sustained translation work was after I'd got my master's degree. For that, you have to do a thesis. Oftentimes it's a book length work. Oftentimes by the time you're done with that first or second draft, you're tired of yourself and your head, and it's very claustrophobic. So I wanted to remain in touch with the creative aspects of writing poems without having to keep hearing my own voice. It felt very much like, Henry in John Barrymans' head, like going on, worse than Achilles with his gripes and plights. So I started casting around to find some work that really resonated with me. And after some significant help from a wider community, I came into contact with the work of Muhammad Khairuddin that just blew me away. So I started working on that, and it was about, I guess I would say like a 4-year project. And it was just so illuminating in so many ways, in terms of linguistics, culture, history, poetics. And so I just have been able to incorporate it more into my creative practice because it's a nice way to do the work without having to do all of the work, right? Because the content already exists, but you're still working with rhythm and cadence and sound and a variety of other formal intricacies, not to mention the other important aspects, which I'm sure we'll dig into a little bit more. Um, and to feel like you're also opening up aspects of global literature that are as yet unavailable to Anglophone readers, which we need. So,
Definitely. Yeah. Do you normally get into who you're going to translate or what book you're going to translate through people you know, through experiences overseas, as you mentioned? How do you get to those
mhm.
texts?
Yeah, I mean the two that I've published so far are mostly through kind of like networks. So when I found this work originally, Jean's book, I found it because of somebody that I met through my translation of Khairuddin. He had written a book review in French of the original book in French. And so I read it and I thought, oh, this work seems really interesting. Let me buy the book. I bought it and it also blew me away. And so I reached out to Jean, who is still alive and very young and producing a lot of really spectacular work. And he was pretty enthusiastic about me taking on the project. So in those two cases, yeah, it was about kind of knowing people, kind of asking around for, I don't know if you call them leads necessarily, but just kind of ideas of where to look. Because existing where I do, I live in the United States. I've lived in the States now for quite a while. I haven't necessarily been back overseas in the various places where I might come more into contact with the poetry scenes. So it's helpful to have people who might be a little bit more plugged in that regard. I am working on a couple other works that I have found just kind of through scouring the internet. Um, right now, I'm working on a translation of a novel that is by this artist from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which I found through just kind of continuing to look for contemporary Congolese literature because we don't have a whole lot of it translated in the US. I mean, Fiston Mwanza Mujila is perhaps the best known Democrat Congolese poet from the DRC, whose work is out with Die Vellum. Fantastic stuff. But beyond that, it's kind of the older, more venerable works, if that at all. So some things that will kind of give me leads will be thinking of what holes do we have in our larger sense of the global canon, the global francophone canon, knowing that there is a lot of, you know, ferment happening everywhere else and just trying to poke around and find where that may be happening.
Cool. Yeah. So speaking of Demeric's No Way in the Skin Without This Bloody Embrace, perhaps you could describe the work just so our audience has an idea of
Mm.
what the book is.
Sure. So the book itself is it's a book-length poem. I think it can be considered both a lyric poem and an epic poem. It has two epigraphs, one from Scylla, as in like Scylla and Charybdis, and then one from Aimé Césaire, both which come from epic poems, the Odyssey and Notebook of a Return. So he's situating it specifically within this kind of larger epic tradition, while at the same time, the poems are very small, they're very voice-driven. They come from a very specific and participatory eye. And they don't necessarily move according to a narrative logic that like they might in, say, the Odyssey. So there is a kind of like lyric twist to it. In addition to that, one of the ways that I've kind of thought about it is that it seems to me like a fusion of three different kind of verse traditions. One might be the kind of Baudelairean flaneur, so that that kind of man about town wandering the metropolis and showing himself off, kind of that fancy artist type. Um, So we have the flaneur. We also have the Afro-Caribbean, Franco-Caribbean tradition, steeped as well in negritude, which we get from Césaire, um, and which is more surreal, much more visceral, decolonial, and also has a very epic sweep. And then the third thing I would say is very specific to Jean's kind of poetic formation himself. He began his poetic apprenticeship, you might say, in the slam scene in Port-au-Prince. So we have this kind of 19th century French romantic poetic tradition. We have this Franco-Caribbean epic negritude tradition, and then we have a contemporary slam kind of performance poetry tradition all brought together. And I guess the final thing that I would say about the poem itself, and we'll talk, I'm sure, more about the content as well, but one of the things that I find especially attractive and evocative about it is that both in content and in form, I think it demonstrates the circumstances out of which the poetic content is emanating. Jean is Haitian. He spends his time in Haiti, but also in Belgium and France. So he lives a kind of exilic life. But as we know, and especially today, but for a long time, Haiti has been in pretty dire political straits. All of which Jean is addressing in some way in the poem. These straits being things that they have been shoved into by external forces, such as France and the US, but also from internal forces through mismanagement and cronyism and other issues of that kind of stripe. And so these circumstances exist kind of off screen, but they inform the progression of the poem, as well as the experiences of the speaker and some of the characters in the poem, but they do not define the entirety of these people or this poem itself. It still finds a way to go beyond these particular strict circumstances. And he does that especially within the formal context and formal innovations of the poem as well, because the margins themselves are very strict, and the poem is always kind of butting up against them and breaking past them in some really fascinating ways. So I know it's not a very concise description, but it's as you know, I think kind of a hard poem to get one's arms fully around.
Oh yeah, I've read it 3 or 4 times now, and every time through, I feel like I get something new out of
Mm.
the work that I glossed over in some manner the first time through. And I still wouldn't say like I'm not going to say I understand the poem, so to speak, mostly because I don't have as much history as I feel is necessary uh,
Hmm.
to glean everything within the poem. But you know, I also don't think I have to have that necessarily to enjoy the poem, to get some of the things the poem is offering, right? So,
Mhm. Sure.
um, yeah. So let's hear this excerpt you've chosen in French. I'll bring it up on the screen so our readers can take a look at it. Um, and whenever you're ready.
Sure. Pour Alep et d'autres ruines. Couche les jours à fuite des sanglots, bafouer la voix humaine. Les peuples se nomment mais ne s'appellent pas. Suffit d'un carton identitaire pour payer des milliers de coups d'orage. L'âme dans la peau des oubliés, le monde qui m'étreint est celui qui blesse. Ça blesse, encre acide qui hante les marges. Le monde blesse, ça sointe quand la main du soldat caresse le métal. L'arme gratuite, malheur à la lèvre qui pousse tes yeux. Rive d'espoir charcutée, nous traversons une époque qui s'écrit en bouquets d'herbes folles, obscure saison, saluant le déclin de nos rétines. Les rêves se couchent nus pour habiller les tombes. Demain a honte de casser ses coquillages. L'espoir est bière chaude sur gueule de bois. Demain, c'est la jeunesse, dit-on, mais silence. Les enfants meurent dans les flottements du genre, les enfants meurent de faim brûlante. De cancer du cerveau ou de cancer de l'esprit, ils meurent. Les enfants meurent tout glacés dans le soleil d'un monde violent. Il n'y a pas de parenthèse pour la mort. Voix d'arc-en-ciel, dans les eaux troubles de l'histoire, nous ne sommes pas ces monstres cauchemars dans les pupilles de l'humanité. sont pas seulement un morceau de terre. Nos têtes ne sont pas de simples cailloux, nos têtes ne sont pas de cailloux sans parole. Mais le monde nous avale, comme une armée de poussière qui ne trouve de secours dans les mains du vent. Nous buvons la mort sans crise de verre, ignorant pourtant toujours le goût de cadavre. En cadavre, de cadavre, des cadavres, nous aimons faire les comptes, nous apprenons à compter. 100 personnes ont disparu par ici, 1000 sont tués par là, 300 000 s'effondrent dans une lointaine falaise insulaire. On oublie tout de suite, on oublie bientôt. Le monde verse de l'eau dans les trous ivres de la mémoire. Nous crachons sur la vie, épluchons l'histoire par les lames de l'ego. Nous ne savons que cracher.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe we could just pause for a second and talk a little bit about uh, the format here, or the form, that is. So we have two very different types of sections here, I would say.
Mhm.
One being free verse with basically no punctuation. And we also have, I guess you could call it almost prose poetry.
Mhm.
It's kind of in that form, where it does have, periods, full sentences, and is in the block format.
Mhm.
So I'm interested in your thoughts on how those move together throughout the work.
Mm. Yeah, it's one of the things that I think I intuitively was dealing with when I was translating, because I think for a lot of the earlier passages, he kind of sticks exclusively to one or the other, but there are some where he'll kind of mix up his methods in a little bit of a way, which creates these interesting visual as well as kind of like prosodic and then semantic rhythms throughout the work itself. Um, I mean, one of the things that drew me to the work overall is the way that he uses these prose blocks and the way by which they help to sketch the margins and how strict the margins are. Because it's hard to tell when we have those free verse sections that he's got the margins so firmly set. Um, at the same time, it's still, those are very concise, they're very brief in and of themselves. And so there's a sense of, I think, kind of like breathless urgency when we have some of these free verse poems. And there's a sense that when we have these prose ones, it's a space where the speaker is able to kind of breathe a little bit more, say a little bit more. But at the same time, there are instances where they will have a word that is longer than the margin will allow them to fully incorporate. And so it'll break halfway through and be moved on to the next. So there's a sense of still this pressure of, if not time, of space, which I think is deeply instructive for the larger circumstances of the poem. It kind of gets back to what you were saying about some of the historical context, where, in some ways it might be nice to have a sense of why these margins themselves are so strict, metaphorically speaking, but we know that they are, and that they are enforcing this kind of constraint upon the speaker. So I get, yeah, one of the ways that I really thought about was in terms of rhythm overall, and kind of the underlying emotion that the speaker might be feeling when they selected one over another kind of form there.
Yeah, no, I really like the shift in the forms throughout. And it's interesting. Sometimes I'll be reading the free verse and then hit one of the prose blocks.
Mm.
And like you feel the shift because of the periods, but nonetheless, like the rhythm doesn't suffer any
Mm.
from the
Mm.
change. You know what I mean? Like it still flows, and I still feel like that sense of urgency that you're talking about, even in the prose blocks, in a manner that maybe I wouldn't feel if it was like a prose block spread out widely on a page.
Mm.
I
Mhm.
think that that format does make you read it a little faster than maybe you normally would uh, an 8.5 by 11, prose block.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's since not everyone knows French, I'd like I'd like to take a look at your an early draft here, of the section. And that way we can get a little of the English for our English listeners in the air.
For Aleppo and other ruins. Sewing the days with a thread of sobs, the fouled human voice, a people names but never calls itself. All you need is some ID to pay for the storm's thousand lashes. Blade in the skin of the left behind, the world that hugs me is the one that wounds. It wounds, acid ink that haunts the margins. The world wounds. It starts to ooze when the soldier's palm caresses metal. Free tears, sadness in Aleppo and its crop of eyes. Shore of hacked up hopes, we are crossing a period that writes itself out with clumps of mad grasses, dreary seasons that hail our retinas setting. The dreams sleep naked, so the graves have clothes. Tomorrow is ashamed to break its shells. Hope is hot beer poured into a hangover. Tomorrow is the youth's, they say, except silence. Children are dying in the day's soft chop. Children are dying from a fiery hunger. From cancer of the brain or cancer of the mind, they're dying. They die totally frozen inside the sun of a vicious world. There is no parenthesis for death. Rainbow lanes through the murky waters of history. We are not the nightmare's sperm and humanity's pupils, not just a scrap of earth. Our heads aren't uncomplicated pebbles. Our heads aren't pebbles without speech. That said, the world swallows us like an army of dust who finds safety in the hands of the wind. We drink up death with no glass spasm, ignoring all the while the noticeable taste of carcass. One carcass, two carcasses, some carcasses. We love taking account. We are learning how to count. 100 people disappeared nearby, 1,000 killed over there, 3,000 collapsed in a distant island cliff. It's forgotten in a flash if it's not forgotten soon. We spit on life, skin history with the blades of ego. We really only know how to spit.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
So once you've done an initial translation, what are you looking at revising when you get to the revision process?
So many things. Because I mean, first off, one of the things is just kind of making sure that what I've clocked in kind of my initial reading and my initial translation is what is there. And I'm not a native speaker of French. I'd say I'm an intermediate to advanced speaker, if I'm being totally frank. Um, and of course, it helps the more fluency you have in terms of catching some of the idiomatic nuances and some of the maybe historical references or resonances that might be happening in the language. And for that, I, do what research I can to try to understand what might be there that I'm not getting immediately. But so the second reading or the second version is often just kind of testing some of the idiomaticity of what I'm seeing there. And if there are some phrases that I've taken too literally, because the first go around is often just like, let's get it out, let's get a very little translation, and then start to shape it a little bit more. And then there's this thing of balancing, which ultimately, and especially in the context of this poem, because the margins are so strict, I there were kind of two things that very specifically for this project, but oftentimes for a lot of the projects that I work on for poetry that I tried to steer by in particular, which was staying faithful to the sonic richness of the original text, and then staying faithful to whatever degree I could to the spatial dimensions of the text. And sometimes this is syntactical about what order are the kind of packets of information arriving in. And then sometimes this is also just like what is on a given line, what is on the next line. So those were things that I was often balancing against this other idea of how much am I communicating the kind of more lived in voice that is one of the more difficult things I think to elucidate in the context of a translation, especially moving from a language like French to English. With French, sometimes it feels as if there isn't as much syntactic or grammatical or lexical complexity as compared to English. This might sound a little chauvinistic. I don't mean to. But in my experience, English has a little bit more in terms of its resources available to it, at least in terms of classical French. And so I've when I return to my translation now, I mean, it's funny that, I sent you an early draft and then a finished draft, though there are changes I might make to the finished draft. A translation draft is really never done, only abandoned, just like I think Valerie said about a poem. Um, but is kind of weighing some of those more particular formal attributes of the poem, such as sound and space, and rhyme and symbol, against the texture and the idiomaticity of the voice. And so I know in one of the questions that you shared with me initially, you noted that one of the big changes in the translation in the between the first and the second draft is this move from but silence to what do I have it? But hush up, right?
Mhm.
And that was a moment where I one recognized that I had taken things too literally in that first translation pass, and second that I would be able to honor slash communicate that particular kind of vocal inflection that kind of lived in feeling that somebody is speaking through these words to us directly because the space allowed for it.
Yeah, and the voice of the speaker is, like you say, it's like more direct, and I think it also fits in with the section better. I think it fits in
Mhm.
with the poem as a whole better. But and it's one of those things where I'm sitting here going, I'm not a translator, except of my own thoughts. Like like that's the only thing I try to translate. And so I'm wondering, you know, when you run through possibilities,
Hmm.
like how many times do you pair up words or phrases
Hmm.
in order to find the one that feels right or fits the best?
Yeah, I guess it comes to I'll do it quite a few times depending on kind of like the heat points of the poem, right? Like where like the heart of the poem seems to be beating either imagistically or emotionally or just in terms of linguistic complexity. And so I'll go through, I mean, depending on the particular linguistic complexity of that moment, I'll go through anywhere from like 3 to 6 different options to try to figure it out. And sometimes it might be more, especially if space is not as much of a consideration as it is in this particular project. Um, but yeah, it's sometimes I wish that I also worked by hand instead of by a computer, because that might allow for some more kind of like insertions, some attempts, some scratchings out, so you can kind of have the palimpsest of the process available to you. Um, but process and revision is always a pretty hideous thing that one almost never wants anybody else to see, let alone oneself.
Yep. Very
And
true.
so
Very true.
I'm sure it's also kind of uncountable the amount of things that I might have suggested in my mind, recorded and erased, and then it's no longer there. Um, but in a given poem, like I guess like in a given passage, there might be 2 to 3 places where I'll be kind of thinking through kind of problem spaces that might have several different solutions.
Yeah, in subtle ways, Jean's writing not only seems to come from his perspective, but from the perspective of Port-au-Prince,
Hmm.
or more broadly Haitians, like you have noted. And you have a translator's note at the end of the book. And in there, you say you want to remind the reader that someone else is in the room
Hmm.
in regard to the geopolitics of Haiti and the translator's role. Could you discuss the importance of that, as well as the challenges inherent in channeling someone else's words and language for an audience who may be unfamiliar with not only the tone of the poem, but the background of the writer?
Hmm. See, I mean, I guess I'll start with the geopolitics. There's so much in that question. It's such a wonderfully complex question that gets to the heart of like everything that I try to do. So you've really hit it on the head there, which I appreciate. Um, I would say that yeah, I'll start with the geopolitical and then get to the aesthetic and kind of translatorly process of it as well. And I'll say that from the geopolitical perspective, both my translation work and my own poetic work is deeply invested in kind of blowing up these myths of American benevolence, Western benevolence, and things of this nature, which so many wonderful artists and poets and writers and translators are also invested in, and it's very important. But I'm sure we all know for how long it's been the case that America has billed itself mythologically as some sort of benevolent actor, and that's not the case. It's very self-interested, both in its particular region, if you look at the Monroe Doctrine, and then in the larger world with this, sense of like exporting democracy and being world police. There's a lot of really messed up things that the US has been involved in that regard. And we shouldn't let anybody get away with that. So um, there's that part. And then, of course, there are very specific cases where I think it's worth illuminating, as in the case of Haiti overall, and in the context for the book that Jean has produced, that we should be reminded that Haiti is not some sort of occasional news item that just blips into our radar whenever some large crisis happens that is completely disconnected from some larger and ongoing history of intervention and difficulty, because Haiti is an incredibly important place historically in and of itself. I mean, it was the first nation to have fully abolished slavery and then to be run exclusively by and for Black folks. Um, and that was deeply threatening to the world order in the early 19th century, which is why France imposed such a large, I don't know if we'd call it a tariff, a bounty, an apology payment. There are a lot of ways we could phrase it, but it orders in the hundreds of billions of euros today that they imposed at that point, and that has been just a constant albatross around the neck of Haiti, economically speaking. And then, of course, there's also the way that the world order shut it out entirely after that as well. And so there are many aspects about the historical Haitian experience that are instructive about the world that we continue to live in. And so when we see the massive earthquake that had struck it in 2010 and the response to it, that's not in any way separate from the initial founding of Haiti, the initial conquest of Saint-Domingue, or Haiti, which it was named by the Taino beforehand. It's deeply involved in all of Western conquest and the bullshit that goes with it. And so I want, through my translation practice and through this particular project, to remind people that we are part of a nation that is run by a government that has a lot of responsibility, both in the past, in the moment, the current moment, and in the future, about what has happened, what is happening, what will happen with Haiti. Communicating that in the context of a poem that's about 80 pages long and is rather difficult. And when I'm translating a poem, obviously I'm very invested in its socio-historical context, because a poem cannot exist independent of that in any way, shape, or form, and I wouldn't begin to pretend that it does. And so that's always a consideration for what brings me to a particular work and how it resonates with me. But I also like to work with poems that resonate with me on a very aesthetic level. And I want to be able to present to a reader in a way that honors the individual potential for experience, an aesthetic document that steps first on its aesthetic foot. So I have to make sometimes some kind of paratextual compromises about what I can and cannot communicate initially. And so you mentioned that I have a translator's note. It's in the back of the book. There's no glossary. There's no front matter that introduces this, aside from just the typical kind of Library of Congress type data, because I want people to engage the poem first and then to receive the context later. Or if they're one of those active readers, they can read the translator's note first and go and do whatever they want to do. But I don't want to mediate more than I already have too much the aesthetic experience of the poem. My ultimate hope is that when somebody reads something that I've translated, is that they're like, oh, okay, I see that this person has translated this. They've made an account of the particular choices, or kind of like waypoints, or I guess I should say like guiding stars that they've used in the translation. I might have made different choices. I'm going to spend more time with the original. I'm going to spend more time learning more about this particular poet, their context, their oeuvre, their nation, the cultural history, and hopefully draw the reader all the way into doing the same thing that I'm doing, so that I don't become, an arbiter for the full experience, but instead they become kind of a more active participant in their own. one might say education, or kind of extended poetic engagement. I think I think that kind of gets the
Oh
points
yeah.
taken.
Yeah. So pertaining to that, the aspect of having the reader participate and having the reader perhaps, especially someone who knows French,
Hmm.
consider how they might have done it differently. Um, how do you feel like about texts that have been translated multiple times? I mean, this is it's kind of a stupid question, but kind of not. Insofar as like, yes, there's someone did this better than someone else. We could make those arguments, all
Hmm.
day long. Um, but sometimes a translation was done 100 years ago, and then a new translation comes along, and there are some obvious reasons why the newer translation might be better than the older translation.
Hmm.
Um, but I guess maybe you could expand upon uh, the idea of multiple people working on the same manuscript and
Hmm.
thinking about how to translate it into one language.
Is there one language though? I might counter that.
Yeah, no, good point.
Which I guess is kind of my answer ultimately, which is that there are so many different Englishes into which one might translate this. Because ultimately, we all have our own kind of idiolect, right? And so much of the idiolects kind of can easily superimpose and create just a circle. And there are just a couple outliers that might make some choices very, very different and obvious. But for the most part, we all share a pretty similar English. Um, but I guess this is so I'm a huge proponent of retranslation while also understanding that US copyright law makes it very difficult for contemporary works to be retranslated. So, I mean, what's really exciting right now is what Emily Wilson, the translator, is doing with her translations of the Odyssey and the Iliad, and kind of helping to uncover some of the, intentional, unintentional, lightly, intensely misogynistic translation practices that go in there, uh, among very many other things. So that's exciting work that she's doing to kind of both refresh it for a contemporary audience while also maybe restoring some of the original intention of the work if we can speak about it in that way. That's harder to do with poets who are alive. But I live in my mind in a utopia where it's possible. And I will say that like my translation process or practice is not extremely experimental when it comes to the work that I translate, because I'm very aware of my station as a white, cis, male, middle class, neurotypical, able-bodied person. And so I do not want to do anything to the original work that seems like it may be manipulating it away from its original intent, again, to the degree that we can speak about original intent. And so for that reason, I don't choose at the moment to work with any avant-garde or experimental translation practices that might radically alter the text that comes out. But I would love for people to do that with the works that I do translate, because there's a range of different processes that you can bring to a translation. Um, and these can be just on the micro level of particular choices about idioms or line breaks, all the way over to very radical translation practices. So that would be great. We don't live in that world yet, but I think we have to envision the world we want before it can arrive sometimes too.
Indeed, indeed. So, speaking of the final draft,
Hmm.
that may or may not be abandoned yet, uh, I'm going to ask you to share that final draft here with our readers. I actually, on my screen, have highlighted the areas that are different so people can check more closely to see like where those revisions happened.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will say too, like I was very glad with this particular book that I was able to get a facing translation, because it makes it easier for people to quote unquote check my work and see what they might do differently. So I'm glad you're also doing that across drafts. For Aleppo and other ruins. sewing the days with a thread of sobs, the tarnished human voice, the people name but never call themselves. All you need is some ID to pay for the storm's thousand lashes. Blade in the skin of the left behind, the world that embraces me is the one that wounds. It wounds, acid ink that haunts the margins. The world wounds, it oozes when the soldier's palm caresses metal. Tears on the house, sadness in Aleppo and its crop of eyes. Shore of hacked up hopes, we are crossing an era that writes itself out with clumps of mad grasses, dreary seasons hailing our retinas fall. The dreams sleep naked so the graves have clothes. Tomorrow is ashamed of breaking its shells. Hope is hot beer poured onto a hangover. Tomorrow is for the young, they say, but hush up. Children are dying in the day's soft chop. Children are dying from a fiery hunger. From cancer of the brain or cancer of the mind, they're dying. They die totally frozen inside the sun of a vicious world. There is no parenthesis for death. Rainbow lanes through the rough waters of history, we are not the nightmare sperm in humanity's pupils, not just a clod of earth. Our heads aren't uncomplicated pebbles. Our heads aren't pebbles without speech, but the world swallows us like an army of dust that only finds safety in the hands of the wind. We drink up death with no glass spasm, ignoring all the while, however, the taste of carcass. One carcass, two carcasses, some carcasses. We love taking account. We are learning how to count. 100 people disappeared near here, 1,000 killed over there, 3,000 collapsed in a distant island cliff. It's forgotten instantly if it's not forgotten soon. We spit on life, pare the skin off history with the blades of ego. We really only know how to spit.
Excellent, thank you. So I notice, this poem is really connected to the body. Um,
Mhm.
a lot of the descriptions, even if they're not about a human specifically as like the subject,
Mhm.
contain something bodily that as a human being we can easily connect to. For example, in that last sentence, we spit on life, pare the skin off history, right? So not only is that putting history within the body, but it also speaks to what he's talking about beforehand with the carcasses, with the
Mhm.
people who have died or who have been killed, um, and so it's this multivalent, multi-level, way of speaking about, I think, Haiti, but also the human experience,
Mhm.
and like I was kind of saying earlier, like it's a way for anyone to connect, uh,
Mhm.
because if you're alive, you have a body, you have a manner in which to consider how you might possibly be in a scenario like this.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think that combined with, I guess, what I was thinking about when I read the book the first time is that it has this very, I think you said, what it has like a driving motion,
Mhm.
like it wants you to go quickly. um I think you said urgency, right, where like the movement can be so fast that you can get caught up in the language and what's happening and feel it physically. And I also think that's why it's important to have some of these prosy sections where you get to kind of slow down a minute and think about what's happening. So I think that push and pull is fascinating. Um, but yeah, I don't know. What are what are your thoughts about the body in relation to the poem?
I mean, I would completely agree. I think that's one of the things that also drew me to this poem in particular, in part because I think the sonic texture and just awareness of the poem is very corporeal. in how it's very active in your mouth. And if you're reading it aloud, you're working through all of these sounds, and you also have a very particular kind of rhythm and cadence that's going. And it creates this kind of this feeling, this inhabitation almost. But then also, yet the imagery itself is very visceral and very corporeal. And I think that is essential for the particular circumstances that Jean is writing out of. Um, because I think that it's often very easy, and this is one of the reasons why I talk about reminding us that America is in the room with us too, is because it's very easy to speak kind of academically or historically about Haiti from our own particular perspective, but this is a history that's been lived. This is a history that's being lived. These are circumstances that have direct contact with people's bodies. And I think that that is also an aspect of why Jean is writing the way that he does. I mean, one of the things I enjoy about his overall poetics is that he has a very corporeal idea of the poem as well. He speaks about it in this book too, where the craft of a poem itself is it's very corporeal. I'm going to try to find a passage in particular because he talks about the notched grammar, grammar of blood. Um, but I don't have it right in front of me. But he speaks very beautifully about and very viscerally about the construction of poems. So it's on page 61. I'll hold it up like a weirdo right here for those to just quickly see, where he says, "To redden the cathedrals, I build myself from impure phrases, notched syntax, I correct myself in this grammar of blood." Where if the I is the speaker, the I is the poem, the I is Port-au-Prince or Haiti, the I is very multivalent within the context of the poem. But he's very aware of how grammar is a physical thing. It is constituted in the body somewhere. So I'm glad that it's evident to you as a reader, because I think that it's essential for the poem.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about one of my questions about like the periods um, brings me to page 57, right before that.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm. Mhm.
Slipshod phalanges, I toss my phrases with abandon into the splendor of ruins, my inkwell, a lurching boat extending them passage, burning the periods, so that sense is suspended, so that their staggering ends well. Right? Like, again, instructive about the poem, but also instructive about the situation, about Haiti, about what he's talking about in this long history of colonialism and, being pushed out maybe from the national stage, so to speak, economically.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, it's I don't know. I really enjoyed the book. And think we could talk about this for a long time. Um, but maybe to wrap this up, I wanted to go back to another thing you said in the translator's note, which actually pertains to what we were just talking about language
Mhm.
as being frangible, and how breakage can sometimes lead to more and not less. And it speaks to the seemingly impossible task of communication in general, even people that speak the same language. As you talked about, is there one language, right?
Mhm.
Um, so to me, like translation then is even trickier to accomplish. What drives you to bridge frangibility, breakage, and understanding?
Hmm. Right, because it's all futile, right? Like you think of what Frost said about poetry is that which is lost in translation, and that poetry itself is economically a losing gambit. Not that it really matters, right? But and I remember reading a David Foster Wallace story a long time ago that somebody speaking to somebody else like poetry is just a way of stating the obvious in a really complicated way. So why does it even exist? And the response that the other character has is, "Do you know anybody who can take the obvious like right off the bat?" Which is pretty fair. But I'll say, I think one of the main reasons is that I continue to do these things and that I think it's important to do these things is for a love of the language, of language in general. I mean, that's what draws me to Jean's work. That's what's drawn me to Jair's work. It is what one, they both exhibit what one might qualify as a kind of virtuoso level of the use of language. They are incredible in their use of it, rhythmically and lexically and imagistically. But at the heart of it, of their work, and so many other great writers' work, is just loving spending time with the materiality of the language itself, its sound and its texture and its weight. Um, Being close to that, even when you're talking about some supremely fucked up things, I think is really invigorating. And it makes me think of two things. One is the Jack Gilbert poem, A Brief for the Defense, which I think is a really fantastic poem, in which he is, or the speaker is, kind of elaborating on all of these terrible circumstances. And like, what do we do? It's kind of a theodicy, right? Wherein he's questioning, how do we live in a world where if there is a God, he's allowed such suffering? What do we do with that? And his thesis ends up being, we must risk delight because otherwise it cheapens everything else. We don't have to be happy, but we need to find delight. And I think language is a great source. I think people who, word workers themselves, find that kind of delight in the language. Which gets me to this. I think it's pretty apocryphal, but somebody asked W.H. Auden, how do you find a good poet? Like before they're really a poet. And he's like, well, give me a person who thinks they have something to say. You give me a person who likes to hang out with words and see what they're going to do. The person who likes to hang out with words is going to be a good poet any day of the week. And so that's what continues to bring me back to the work because language is ridiculous. Like
Yeah.
we're just a bunch of apes grunting, and somehow we've made all of these things happen. And it's pretty fantastic and
Yeah.
miraculous.
No, I mean, it's true. It's so true. One of my favorite things personally is puns, and
Mhm.
it's it's both like I think it's both endearing to people and mortifying to them at the same time, right? Like they're like, "You're still a child," and I'm like, "Yep." With puns, yes, that is correct. Uh,
But what's better about the alternative,
yeah,
right? Be a
exactly.
child, right?
And you do talk about that also in here, not about puns, but about when we talked about the frangibility, right? Like carcass on one of the sections was broken before, and the meaning of the first part of the word and the second part of the word offer that uh, the strangeness of multiple ideas coming in at the same time,
Yeah.
right? Like that's so neat. Like that's why, you know, I love talking about language and using language, and it's the same as you, basically, just a different way of saying it, you
Yeah.
know. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean,
I like that you point that out too, because that's again one of the features about this book that I found so innovative formally, and that I think is especially important about the post-colonial perspective that Jean brings to language, because obviously he's very good at language, he loves language, uh, and he delights in kind of its arbitrariness, right? Because we know that language doesn't emerge out of the qualities that it's trying to describe naturally; it's all just applied randomly, and we've just kind of agreed over time that this is what is done. Um, but that arbitrariness is both a source of delight and a source of interrogation. Like we should be also, we should enjoy it, but we should be conscientious at the same time of how we use language and maybe higher charged instances where language can turn into action because it has this real effect upon the world, upon people, upon bodies, upon the future. So there is an ethical dimension to the delight that we take as well, which I think he balances in a way that is maybe more lighthearted than it seems initially.
definitely, yeah. Well, Connor, thank you so much for being with me today, for talking about Jean Demerique's No Way in the Skin Without This Bloody Embrace, out at Ugly Duckling. Right now, go get yourself a copy. Again, I appreciate your time and going through translation with me.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to do this. It's great to talk about the work.
Excellent. Take care.
You too.